Amsterdam's Paradiso Club was packed with 400 restless Europeans waiting for a band they'd only heard about through underground tape trading networks. It was November 25, 1989, and Nirvana was scheduled to take the stage in less than 2 hours for what was supposed to be their breakthrough European debut. But Kurt Cobain was sitting on a curb outside the venue with his head in his hands, staring at an empty van. Every single piece of their equipment was gone, stolen, vanished into the Amsterdam night like smoke. The guitars, the drums, the amps, everything they'd scraped together over years of playing dive bars in the Pacific Northwest had disappeared in the 3 hours they'd left the van unattended to grab dinner. Kurt's hands were shaking, not from anger, but from the crushing weight of failure pressing down on his chest. This was supposed to be their moment, their chance to prove that American underground rock could connect with European audiences, their opportunity to show that grunge wasn't just a Seattle thing, but something universal. And now they had nothing. No instruments, no equipment, no way to play, and 400 people inside who'd paid money to see them perform. Chris Novoselic, Nirvana's bass player, was pacing back and forth in front of the venue, his lanky frame casting long shadows under the streetlights. Chad Channing, their drummer at the time, sat silently against the wall, drumsticks still in his back pocket, useless now without drums to hit. Their tour manager Alex was inside the club trying to explain the situation to the promoter, a stern-faced Dutchman named Henrik, who'd invested his own money to bring these unknown Americans to Amsterdam. Kurt could hear raised voices coming from inside the venue, Henrik's Dutch-accented English cutting through the ambient noise of the city. "You tell them they play, or they pay back every guilder I spent on this show. Every single one." Alex emerged from the club looking pale. "He says if we don't perform, we owe him for the deposits, the advertising, everything. We're talking about more money than we made all year." Kurt laughed bitterly. "How are we supposed to perform without instruments? Does he want us to beatbox?" Chris stopped pacing and looked at Kurt with an intensity that cut through the despair. "We have to do something. We can't just cancel. This kills the whole European tour. Every other promoter will hear about it, and we'll never get booked again." Kurt stood up from the curb, his mind racing. The easiest thing would be to cancel, to admit defeat, to go home and tell everyone that Europe didn't work out. That's what a reasonable person would do. That's what anyone would expect. But Kurt Cobain had never been particularly interested in doing what people expected. An idea was forming in his head, crazy and desperate, but an idea nonetheless. "What if we play anyway?" Kurt said quietly. Chris stared at him. "Play with what? Air guitars? Come on, man." "No, I mean really play. We find instruments somehow. There's got to be a way." Chad spoke up for the first time. "Kurt, it's 7 p.m. on a Saturday night in Amsterdam. Every music store is closed. Even if we had money to buy new gear, which we don't, there's nowhere to buy it." But Kurt was already walking toward the venue entrance with that focused intensity he got when an idea had taken hold of him. Inside the Paradiso, Kurt found Henrik in his office, still fuming. The promoter looked up as Kurt entered, his expression hardening. "You come to tell me you're canceling?" "No," Kurt said, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "I came to ask for your help." Henrik leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "My help? You lose your equipment and you want my help?" "I want to play tonight," Kurt said. "I want to give these people the show they paid for, but I need you to help me find instruments." "And where do you think I'm going to find a guitar, bass, drums, and amplifiers in 2 hours on a Saturday night?" Kurt met his eyes. "You've been promoting shows in Amsterdam for how long? 10 years? 15? You must know every musician in this city. There's got to be local bands, people who owe you favors, someone with equipment sitting in their practice space." Henrik studied Kurt for a long moment. There was something about this skinny American kid with the intense blue eyes that gave him pause. Most bands in this situation would be making excuses or looking for a way out. This kid was looking for a way through. "You're serious," Henrik said. "You'd actually try to perform on borrowed equipment you've never played before?" "I'd perform on kitchen pots and a broomstick if it meant keeping our word to the people who paid to see us," Kurt said. Something shifted in Henrik's expression. He picked up his phone and started dialing. What happened over the next 90 minutes became the stuff of Amsterdam underground music legend. Henrik made call after call, pulling every favor he accumulated over a decade of promoting shows. A local punk band agreed to lend their bass amp. A death metal group said Nirvana could use their drum kit. A folk musician who owed Henrik money offered up an acoustic guitar and a battered Stratocaster knockoff. But the calls came with conditions. The punk band wanted to meet these Americans who were crazy enough to try to play a show with borrowed gear. The metal drummers insisted on watching the performance to make sure their kit wasn't damaged. Everyone, it seemed, wanted to witness what they assumed would be a disaster. By 8:30 p.m., a mismatched collection of equipment had been assembled on the Paradiso stage. The bass amp was twice as powerful as what Christ usually played through. The drum kit was set up completely wrong for Chad's playing style. And the guitars, well, the acoustic was missing 2 strings, and the electric was so out of tune it sounded like a cat being strangled. Kurt looked at this Frankenstein collection and felt something unexpected. Not fear, but excitement. This wasn't going to be a normal show. This was going to be raw and unpredictable in a way that perfect equipment could never be. "We have maybe 20 minutes to figure out how to play our songs on this stuff," Christ said. They ran through About a Girl, and it sounded awful. Blue was even worse, producing feedback that made everyone wince. By 8:50 p.m., Kurt made a decision that would define Nirvana's approach to performance for years to come. "We're not trying to sound like our recordings. We're just going to play as hard and honest as we can with what we've got. If it sounds chaotic, fine. This is what real punk rock is supposed to be." At 9 p.m., Henrik walked on stage to introduce them. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight you're going to see something special. These Americans lost all their equipment today. Everything. What you're about to hear is them playing on borrowed instruments they've practiced on for 20 minutes. Give them your patience and your energy. This is Nirvana from Seattle, Washington." The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some people applauded the underdog story. Others groaned, expecting a train wreck. A few headed to the bar, assuming this would be unwatchable. Kurt walked to the microphone, picked up the battered Stratocaster copy, and looked out at the sea of skeptical European faces. For a moment, the weight of it all threatened to crush him again. Then he remembered why he'd started playing music in the first place. Not to sound perfect or professional, but to express something real, something raw, something that couldn't be expressed any other way. He hit the opening chord of School and everything exploded. The oversized bass amp made Christ's playing sound like an earthquake. Chad was hitting the drums so hard to compensate for the weird setup that every beat felt like a punch to the chest. And Kurt's guitar, out of tune and buzzing through an amp that was clearly designed for folk music, sounded absolutely unhinged. It shouldn't have worked. By every conventional measure of a good rock show, this was a disaster. The timing was off, the sound was muddy, the tuning was questionable at best. But something was happening in that room, something that transcended technical perfection. The crowd felt it immediately. This wasn't a polished American band playing a set they'd rehearsed 1,000 times. This was 3 guys fighting for their lives on stage, pouring every ounce of desperation and determination into borrowed equipment, refusing to let circumstances defeat them. By negative creep, the entire venue was moving. The mosh pit was violent, cathartic, real. People were screaming words to songs they'd only heard on cassette tapes, connecting with the raw emotion in a way studio perfection never could. Kurt switched between guitars like a man possessed. When the acoustic's missing strings made a song impossible, he'd play it on the electric. When the electric produced feedback, Kurt leaned into it, making it part of the song, turning technical failure into artistic choice. During Love Buzz, the guitar strap broke. Kurt didn't stop. He just knelt down and kept playing, turning the equipment failure into raw vulnerability that made the song hit even harder. But then something happened that nobody could have predicted. During Floyd the Barber, Kurt's voice started to give out. The stress of the day, the emotional weight of almost losing everything, the sheer intensity was destroying his vocal cords. His voice was cracking, breaking, barely holding together. A professional performer would adjust, would hold back to preserve their voice. Kurt did the opposite. He pushed harder. He screamed louder. He let his voice shatter completely, turning the song into a primal howl of rage and pain and determination. The crowd went absolutely insane. This wasn't entertainment. This was someone bearing their soul on stage, holding nothing back, giving everything. When they had nothing left, Henrik was watching from the side with tears streaming down his face. He'd promoted hundreds of shows. He'd seen professional musicians with perfect equipment deliver flawless performances. But he'd never seen anything with this much heart, this much raw humanity. After Floyd the Barber, Kurt tried to speak, but his voice was so destroyed he could barely whisper. "This is the best show we've ever played," he croaked, and the crowd roared agreement. They finished with Blue, and by the end, Kurt's hands were bleeding from the acoustic's broken strings. Chad had broken a drumstick and was playing with his hands. Chris's fingers had blisters from the unfamiliar bass. When the last note rang out, there was absolute silence. Then the crowd exploded into applause that didn't stop for 5 minutes. People were crying. People were hugging each other. The local musicians who'd lent their equipment stood stunned, having witnessed their familiar gear create something they never knew was possible. Backstage, Kurt collapsed, his voice completely gone, his hands throbbing, his body shaking from adrenaline. The folk guitarist walked up to him. "You can keep the guitar. After what you did tonight, it belongs to you now." The punk band told Chris, "We thought we understood punk rock. You just showed us we were playing it safe." The death metal drummers found Chad. "You hit our drums harder than we ever have. That kid is yours now. You earned it." Henrik came backstage with whiskey. "In 15 years of promoting shows, I've never seen anything like that. You turned disaster into triumph." But the most important moment came an hour later, when most of the crowd had left. A young Dutch musician approached Kurt, eyes red from crying. "I was about to quit music," the kid said. "I thought if I didn't have the perfect equipment, the perfect setup, there was no point. You just proved that wrong. It's not about the gear." Kurt looked at this kid and saw himself 5 years earlier, unsure and afraid. "The only thing you need to make music," Kurt said, his destroyed voice barely above a whisper, "is the need to make music. Everything else is just details." The Amsterdam show became legendary in European underground music circles. Bootleg recordings of that night, despite terrible audio quality, circulated for years. Music magazines wrote about it. Other bands told the story as an example of what real punk rock attitude looked like. But more importantly, the experience fundamentally changed how Nirvana approached performance. They stopped worrying about sounding like their recordings. They stopped trying to recreate studio perfection. Instead, they embraced chaos, unpredictability, rawness. Every show became an opportunity to push to the edge and beyond, to give everything, regardless of circumstances. Years later, when Nirvana was playing stadiums and could afford any equipment they wanted, Kurt would sometimes deliberately use battered, imperfect gear. He'd play guitars out of tune or amps barely functioning, chasing that same feeling of raw authenticity they'd accidentally discovered in Amsterdam. "That night when we lost everything taught me the most important lesson of my career," Kurt told a journalist in 1992. "You don't need perfect circumstances to create perfect moments. Sometimes the imperfection is what makes it perfect." The guitars, bass amp, and drum kit donated to Nirvana that night became their primary touring equipment for the next year. Every time Kurt picked up that battered Stratocaster, he remembered what it felt like to have nothing and still refuse to quit. The story of Nirvana's Amsterdam disaster turned triumph spread through Europe like wildfire. Young bands stopped obsessing over having perfect gear before performing. Promoters became more willing to take chances on unknown acts who showed determination over polish. The culture shifted, valuing authenticity over perfection, heart over technical proficiency. In 1991, when Nevermind exploded and Nirvana became the biggest band in the world, Henrik received a package from America. Inside was a gold record for the album, and a note from Kurt that read, "This started in your club, with your help. Thank you for believing in 3 idiots who lost their equipment. This is as much yours as it is ours." Henrik hung that gold record in the Paradiso next to a photo from that November night in 1989. The photo shows Kurt on stage with the borrowed guitar, his face contorted in raw emotion, his hands bleeding, his voice shot, giving absolutely everything to 400 people who'd shown up to see an unknown American band. The young Dutch musician who'd been ready to quit that night started a band dedicated to playing shows with whatever equipment they could find. They never became famous, but they played Amsterdam clubs for 15 years, always telling the story of how Nirvana had saved their love of music. For Kurt Cobain, personally, that night in Amsterdam represented something deeper than just a successful show. It was proof that his worth as an artist wasn't tied to material possessions or perfect conditions. It was validation that raw emotion and honest expression could overcome any obstacle. In his personal journals, Kurt wrote about Amsterdam multiple times. One entry from 1993 reads, "When we had nothing in Amsterdam, we had everything that mattered. We had the music, we had each other, and we had the determination to keep going no matter what. Sometimes I wish we could go back to that." The story of Nirvana's stolen equipment and the show that followed became more than just a footnote in rock history. It became a parable about resilience, creativity under pressure, and the true spirit of punk rock. It showed that greatness doesn't require perfect circumstances. Sometimes you need everything to fall apart before you discover what you're really capable of. The equipment stolen that night never recovered. But that theft gave Nirvana something more valuable than guitars and amplifiers. It gave them a defining moment, a story that captured who they were and what they stood for. Kurt Cobain could have canceled that show. He could have made excuses, blamed circumstances, protected himself from failure. Instead, he chose to play anyway, to fight through impossible circumstances, to give everything he had, even when he had nothing. And in doing so, he didn't just save one European tour. He defined what Nirvana would become. A band that refused to compromise, that valued authenticity over perfection, that would rather fail spectacularly while trying something real than succeed with something safe and polished. Sometimes losing everything is how you find out what really matters. For Kurt Cobain and Nirvana, what mattered was the connection, the honesty, the willingness to be vulnerable and real in front of strangers.